Okay, today we're going to discuss Cornel West's A Genealogy of Modern Racism. In this discussion, West is describing an explanation or a variable that is underanalyzed for the existence of white supremacy and the nature of modern racism. And he thinks this white supremacy comes in part from what he calls modern discourse. So I want to talk about a few themes from the piece before we discuss it. The first is, what is this notion of white supremacy that he's discussing? First of all, he says that white supremacy is found in the everydayness of life. It is embedded in the institutions and practices and cultural artifacts and habits and normal life aspects that we find in the West and in the United States. And so that's where we should look for it, in the everyday folkways, as he says. It is maintained in this everydayness, and he believes that this is because it is integrated into modern discourse. If we look at the bottom of the first page of the piece, he says, this logic is manifest in the way in which controlling metaphors, notions, and categories of modern discourse produce and prohibit, develop and delimit specific conceptions of truth and knowledge, beauty and character, so that certain ideas are rendered incomprehensible or unintelligible. So what is modern discourse? Discourse is a term we use for all of the ways that we speak about, write about, and think about the world that we live in. So discourse is a very general term, not just about the way we discuss things, but also the way we understand things. And he believes that discourse, the structure of modern discourse, makes certain ideas thinkable and others unintelligible. And these are integrated into the very metaphors and ideas that we use to sort of decode the world or to navigate the world. So what he wants to do is essentially a genealogy of white supremacy and a genealogy of modern discourse. This is similar to the project that Nietzsche undertakes. Nietzsche looked at morality. West will look at modern discourse. So he says on 49 that he will do this genealogy of modern discourse in order to uncover the idea of white supremacy as embedded within it. So what is the structure that he's specifically talking about? He believes that modern discourse develops because of three historical processes that are in some ways random. They could have been very different historical processes that occur in Europe, but these happen to sort of combine to produce the structure of modern discourse that we have today. These three elements are first, the scientific revolution, right? We'll talk a little bit about what the scientific revolution entails. Second, this notion of Cartesian philosophy broadly construed, sort of as a placeholder for what Cartesian philosophy stands for. And third, a classical revival. So let's take each of those in turn. The scientific revolution is this notion that the world is discernible through scientific investigation, through experiment, through hypothesis, through observation. We can scientifically derive truth from the world around us. This becomes a central aspect of the Enlightenment thinking in Europe at this period of time. It is combined with Cartesian philosophy, and West argues that two major figures, Bacon and Descartes, combine to produce this notion of philosophy. What are these? What aspects do they add in? Well, Bacon essentially tells Europe and the world that humans have a distinctive mastery over nature, and that nature and the world around us is governed by universal laws. Those laws can be discerned by humans and ultimately controlled by humans. So there's nothing inscrutable about nature. The only thing that's required is more investigation. So this is why we call Bacon an empiricist. Descartes, on the other hand, is going to argue that rationality is the core, sort of the key for understanding how the world works, for understanding truth. And this rationality comes from the individual subject and is used to predict or explain observable things, observable objects around us. So we have the individual thinker and the objects around them being described by this thinker. Finally, we have classical revival, which I'll talk about in a minute. But essentially, Europe after the Dark Ages became obsessed with ancient Greek and Roman thought, particularly their notion of aesthetics, their art forms, and the types of theater and sculpture that they saw in ancient Greece and Rome became a touchstone for European Enlightenment thinking. They believed that the Greeks had tapped into a crucial notion of what beauty was, what aesthetics were. And so all three of these begin to combine to produce the structure of modern discourse. And again, this is just a sort of a random confluence of events that produce this condition. You can see the West sum up of this on page 53, the last paragraph. So he then divides the stages of modern racism into two stages. The first stage is this notion of the notion of the normative gaze. And this is what I was getting at just a minute ago, that it was the way we can identify something as beautiful is through looking back to Greek conceptions of it. So the ideal standard by which we can judge all other things is through the Greek embodiment. For the Greeks, beauty is centered around the human body, the individual body. That's why you have these depictions of the individual body. So it's not landscapes and it's not all these other potential artistic devices, but rather the individual body. And so the Europeans say this is the pinnacle of what beauty is. Of course, those bodies happen to be Western European white bodies that are being depicted. So he says on 54, what is distinctive about the role of classical aesthetic and cultural norms at the advent of modernity is that they provided an acceptable authority for the idea of white supremacy, an acceptable authority that was closely linked with a major authority on truth and knowledge in the modern world, namely the institution of science. Interestingly for West, he believes that this aesthetics, because it came to be alongside the Enlightenment, alongside scientific revolution and Cartesian philosophy, it brought with it the authority of truth and knowledge. That it wasn't just a subjective argument that this was beauty, it could be provable, that there was definitive truth-based evidence claims about beauty. So this is married to a development in natural history, in this first stage, that natural history essentially comes to be in the Enlightenment, and it is a way of describing all natural things through observable traits. So we can organize and categorize a taxonomy of animals and plants and living things and non-living things based on comparable observable traits. And therefore we can develop an entire, taxonomy of all things that we can observe. So these two things in combination, right? A truth-based history of observable traits and characteristics in combination with an authoritative claim to the aesthetic superiority of the white body. These two came into combination to produce the first stage of modern racism.